Welcome to section 2.2, Biogeochemical Cycles. We're going to look at how the nutrients cycle through the air and water and earth and through organisms, and how these substances continue to be recycled. And at each step, we've got the nutrients in different forms. So we've talked a lot about how oxygen and carbon dioxide are cycled between autotrophs and heterotrophs, but we're going to look at some other nutrients as well. And sometimes they are cycled very quickly, rapid cycling, and sometimes they will stay in some form for millions of years, like when fossil fuels hold carbon for millions of years. That would be called slow cycling. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, these are the ones that are going to be found in air and water, as well as organisms, whereas phosphorus cycle, we will find that it's not found in the air at all. So it'll go through soil and water, but not through the air. We'll see that as we look at the cycles. We know that cellular respiration is releasing a lot of carbon dioxide. We know that forest fires release a lot of carbon dioxide, and we know that if we're looking at the carbon dioxide in the blue section here, burning fossil fuels is releasing CO2, as well as all organisms doing respiration, and even plants, if they're as they're doing respiration, release some CO2. But we can also see that when microorganisms decompose and make compost, they also release CO2. What is using up the CO2 is the plants. You can see them as they photosynthesize, they use it up. Now looking at the oxygen, the fires will consume oxygen, and of course consumers will consume oxygen, and so will decomposers use up oxygen. Those are pretty easy to know. So this is back from chapter 5, how cellular respiration makes the carbon dioxide and water that photosynthesis will use. Trees and forests, they consider those carbon sinks because they will hold on to a lot of carbon in their lifetime. They will only when it dies and decomposes will or burned will that carbon be released. So it's kind of a carbon sink. And when we deforest, do deforestation, a lot of carbon is released into the atmosphere. Photosynthetic organisms make a lot, especially in the ocean, make a lot of carbon, or hold a lot of carbon, and a lot of it will end up accumulating on the ocean floor and turned into rocks and eventually fossil fuels. So they consider the ocean the largest carbon sink. Limestone is something that contains carbon. It's calcium carbonate. And when we have the weathering of the shells, the limestone shells, crushing and weathering, we have some carbon released back into the soil, air, and water that way. In terms of combustion of fossil fuels, that's a quick release of CO2 into the atmosphere, and they feel like Industrial Revolution really increased carbon dioxide levels because of all the fossil fuel burning. And when you look at how much is in the atmosphere, how much is released by burning fossil fuels, they feel that there might be a missing component as they try add up all the carbon. But basically, we've got slow cycling here in purple, so places that the carbon stays for a long time would be in fossil fuels or in the Earth's crust or ocean, whereas the fast, rapid carbon cycling would be things like the living organisms that are using it by photosynthesis, or the combustion that and respiration processes that happen. So we're going to look at our second cycle, and that's the sulfur cycle. So this one, we have heard of sulfates maybe that are used in as a important nutrient for plants, and they will when they decompose, put it back into the soil. So what we're looking at here is how bacteria help to convert the types of sulfur products from one kind to another. So this Winogradsky column just shows how bacteria is used, different bacteria is used to convert the different sulfur components. And I was just showing that they can demonstrate that in a tube. So with sulfur cycle, there's some sulfur dioxide given off when fossil fuels burn, and that will go into the atmosphere as sulfate, but fall as acid rain when it comes to the ground. And those sulfates can come and accumulate in the ground. They can change into different forms, but plants do need those sulfates for a nutrient. And when they decompose, that's like a quick way of those sulfates going back into the earth. So decomposing like compost has sulfates. That's a good nutrient for plants. There is some like fossil fuel burning, I think I mentioned, and volcanoes that can bring sulfates back up as well. All right. So we're going to look at nitrogen cycle, and this is an important one. Nitrates are also very useful as a fertilizer for plants, and we know that N2 in the atmosphere is atmospheric nitrogen is not something that we can use. We breathe it in, breathe it out. Plants can't use it as that form of nitrogen. However, there are little nitrogen fixing bacteria that are in the roots, little lumps, little root nodules of some plants like legumes and alfalfa, and they can do the magical thing of turning the nitrogen into ammonium, which will go from ammonium to nitrates. So nitrogen fixing bacteria, if you're doing like organic crop rotation, you might want to have that as one of the crops that you know is going to put those nitrates, those fertilizers naturally into your soil. And an interesting thing is that you know how beautiful and green and lush things seem outside after a lightning storm. There's a cool thing that can happen here. Lightning can actually take that atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into nitrates. So along with the rain coming down in a thunderstorm, then the lightning is actually also like fertilizing. So that's a really cool thing that can happen. The thing that is not so great is that we do have denitrifying bacteria that in a lack of oxygen, so like in lawn that's way too packed and roots aren't getting oxygen, they can actually turn the nitrates into free nitrogen. So you don't want those that's in your soil. You don't want to have a lack of nitrogen. So people often aerate their lawn and make little puncture holes in it so that the roots get oxygen, so this doesn't happen. But there is that process where nitrogen can be lost. Okay. Nitrogen is part of our proteins. Remember, proteins are made of nitrogen, so we need them for that. We need them for DNA. And so looking at a very awesome thing, those little bacteria in here in the nodules of like beans, you can pull up a bean or a pea or alfalfa sprouts and see these little nodules, but there are bacteria in there that can change the nitrogen from the air into nitrates. And so that's something that is a very cool thing. And there's a symbiosis there of the plant giving food to the bacteria, and the bacteria are basically giving the plant fertilizer. Okay, when we have like compost, organic matter is broken down with decomposers, that's called ammonification. We saw that that's the soil bacteria can turn the ammonia into nitrites and then nitrates. We saw that in our cycle just now. And then, of course, the denitrification. If there is a lack of oxygen in anaerobic conditions, we can have a loss of nitrogen, and our nitrates can get sadly put back as nitrogen into the air. So we don't want that to happen. And this is just reviewing again that nitrogen-fixing bacteria can turn nitrogen into ammonia, which then will eventually convert back into nitrates. And we have the ammonia being able to turn into nitrites and then nitrates, which is awesome for basically fertilizing. And then the denitrifiers can take our valuable nitrates and turn them back into nitrogen. So those are just reviews of what we just mentioned in the graph. Okay, our last one is phosphorus cycle. And phosphorus is found in ATP, in DNA, genetic material. It's in your bones, your teeth. And this is the one that you don't find in the air. So that phosphorus will cycle through soil and through water, and we will get it from eating certain plants. We can get phosphorus that way. Phosphates are basically a fertilizer as well for plants, but too many phosphates can cause algal bloom. And so we know that nitrates can also be a one of those fertilizers that can contribute to algal bloom. But when they did the test of whether it was more nitrogen or more phosphorus that causes algal bloom, this in Ontario, this was a famous experiment that showed that nitrogen is not as responsible for algal bloom as phosphorus is. So that's when the ban started, so that we have phosphate-free detergents and soaps, because that was running off into lakes and streams and causing this algal bloom. So if you have algae growth in, we see that a lot in our Alberta lakes, where there's a lot of cabins and fertilizers, or lawn fertilizers, or even like if someone's running off detergents from their washing machines into just out onto their grass, eventually it ends up into lakes, and it will cause this algal bloom. So this one is basically showing that plants that decompose can put the phosphates in the soil, which will then eventually be being brought up and used by plants again. Decomposers can put it into the soil, and it can form new rock, so it will go into the rocks, weather in the rocks. And so basically our plants, animals, and rocks are cycling this phosphorus, but the atmosphere does not contain any phosphorus. Alrighty. Just a review of algal bloom. When we have too much phosphates in our water, the algae starts growing, and the sun can't get in, and the plants further down can't photosynthesize. So we have a whole bunch of dead plants and algae getting decomposed, using up oxygen, depleting that water of oxygen, and then we can eventually get fish dying, and like low oxygen levels are going to cause fish death. So that is the concern with algal blooms, and of course you don't want to swim in that either. So there you go. There's all our cycles, and